Okay, the long-awaited next tutorial. So this is for the section where you are discussing Orakau's contributions to New Zealand's colonial narrative. And there are a couple of bullet points, or more than a couple, there's a few bullet points on the template that you are writing about. The first one is the first bullet point asks you to describe the myth or legend of New Zealand race relations. So you got to sort of say what that is and what's meant by that. Now, just bear in mind this. I've put everything on the website, on the page on the website that relates to this section. Don't just regurgitate what's up there. There's a lot of stuff up there. This section doesn't necessarily have to be a big section. You've got to cherry pick, take out what you need to address the bullet points. So I'm going to begin with a little bit of context. Now you can expand on some of these things, but the context to this is perspectives. Okay, so the dominant perspective for a long time, which formulated this myth of New Zealand's perfect race relations, the dominant perspective was a very much a colonial perspective. But perspectives in histories are very revealing, and they're multifaceted, which means there's lots of different parts to perspectives, or lots of different things or parts that influence a perspective. So those influences are ethnicity and culture, obviously. So if we're looking at a colonial perspective, one of the influences, the ethnic influence there is European, and European culture, because that is the dominant voice in the colonial perspective in New Zealand. Then class. So class is the socio-economic influences, and there are different nuances. Like you got low class, middle class, and upper class, sort of the traditional pyramid. So the more educated tended to come from those who could afford a high level of education, and they came from the upper class. Okay, and we've got geography. So where you were living at certain times may have an influence on your perspective. So people living in cities, for instance, people living in the cities where there are university towns, that has an impact on their perspective. Their perspectives might be one that's very grounded in a European perspective in this case, because they're living in essentially European society. In Auckland, in the city of Auckland, and Wellington, and Christchurch, okay, in the colonial period. And then politics. There's also some people who may be thinking in terms of a more traditional conservative point of view to the more liberal progressive points of view. So those are all different influences. They're not the only ones, but they're the significant influences that have a part to play in how people view society and how people view the past. In New Zealand's experience, there was one particularly dominant voice that emerged from the 19th into the 20th century, and that was, as I've been pointing out, I guess, as I've been alluding to, the Pākehā or European narrative about New Zealand's culture and identity. So by 1920, it was New Zealand defined itself very much in how the European experience viewed recent history since 1840, and in particular the history since the wars of the 1860s. The other voice was that of Māori, and which was at that stage from the 19th into the 20th century increasingly marginalised, which means pushed to the side. So the only voice that really got any traction in the media and the newspapers and whatever books that were written about New Zealand was the European Pākehā perspective. The Māori perspective was increasingly sort of pushed aside, and we call it marginalised. Okay. Now, you have heard me talk about revisionist historians before. By the end of the 20th century, revisionist historians like Judith Binney and Vincent O'Malley, who wrote in Te Auhou, which is in the website, in the notes on the webpage, they argue that Māori and Pākehā views of the past diverged, which means split, and became quite separate from about 1920. So the way the Māori viewed the past, particularly the post 1840 period, Māori viewed it very differently to how Pākehā viewed it. Okay. Now the Pākehā view became the dominant view. Bellich refers to it as a lens, so it becomes the dominant lens of who we are and how we got to be who we are at that, by 1920. And a part of and that view of who we are and how we got to be the way we were by 1920 saw the emergence or development of a myth of race relations in New Zealand. And that's bringing me to, what is this myth? What is the myth or legend of race relations in New Zealand? And the myth was simply this. By the 1920s, New Zealanders felt, with looking through the European lens, that New Zealand was a very harmonious society. It was happy, a very happy and bicultural society. Okay, and in fact, New Zealand was the world leader in race relations. That was the myth. That was the point of view of many Europeans living at that time, and it was celebrated by Europeans. Now, the evidence of this, it's all right for me to say this, but the evidence of this can be seen in the writings of historians at the time, people at the time. The one key person that I mention in the notes is a guy called William Pember Reeves, and he helped shape this perception in a book called State Experiments in Australia and New Zealand. So, you can mention that. That's evidence of this myth. He put it out there in that book, okay? And in that book, he wrote about New Zealand's identity being shaped by the frontier, the experiences of having a frontier, of war, and through the importance of Māori in their in the I guess what Māori did in that context. They were the enemy, they were the rebels in the war. They were the people who were needing to be civilized. Okay. Now James Cowan, a slightly later historian, he wrote a series of books around the New Zealand wars, and he continued to write in this vein of New Zealand being New Zealanders, Europeans who were living and settled in New Zealand, and perhaps by the 1920s had been born in New Zealand. They continued to perpetuate this idea that New Zealand had really harmonious race relations. And when he wrote his books on the New Zealand wars, the unglamorous things, the things that weren't good, that were committed by British soldiers, were exactly that. They were committed by British soldiers, not colonial soldiers. After the war ended, they went away. The colonial soldiers didn't do that sort of thing. So that was very much the vein that James Cowan wrote in. And by doing so, he helped present this idea that race relations in New Zealand was quite harmonious. And by the 1920s, we were a leading light around the Commonwealth. Now, this is a myth, okay? This is a myth because it was shaped and developed by a series of ideas that weren't necessarily grounded in facts, okay? And it wasn't balanced, okay? It wasn't balanced because it didn't necessarily include Māori and iwi perceptions of what happened during the wars and afterwards and how they were affected by it, okay? And that's why it's a myth, because it's not necessarily true. This is the first tutorial on this particular part of your assignment. Please watch it a number of times and feel free to message me, and I can arrange to have some face-to-face video chats as well. The next clip will deal with how Orakau contributed to this myth. So what happened? How did the way in which the Battle of Orakau, how it was reported, how it was recorded in European, how did that contribute? What did that do to contribute to this myth of race relations? That's what my next topic will be. Next part will be on. Thank you.